guest speaker. Dorinda, so I'm just getting your bio here. Multitasking this is a new way for us to do things this weekend. Dorinda has always, or Dorinda Kruger, actually, to be proper. Dorinda Kruger has always been very interested in both poetry and history and grew up surrounded by books. After being introduced to the Maine's Pincock family fonds at the University of Waterloo Library's Special Collection and Archives, Dorinda began researching Canadian spiritualist poet Jenny O'Hara Pincock. That initial introduction spawned a decade-long fascination with early Canadian spiritualist history, and in particular, Jenny Pincock. Dorinda has retraced Jenny's steps from her childhood home in Madoc, Ontario, to Lilydale, to her grave in St. Catharines, and eventually wound her back to the First Spiritualist Church of Gaul, where Dorinda now attends. I would like to welcome Dorinda to serve and to inspire us and teach us something new. Now, I have asked Randy to give you sharing. Do you have it okay there?
Share screen. Yes, it looks like.
Beautiful.
So I think we're okay. There we go. Thank you for asking me this morning. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the Haldimand Tract, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. And I'm located specifically on the Haldimand Tract in Kitchener, Ontario, which is ironically where Jenny Pincock died, but we're going to come all the way around back to that. During the month of March, in particular, for the birth of modern spiritualism, I was listening to a lot of lectures that were talking about the Fox sisters and what was happening in America to start modern spiritualism. And we hear a lot about British history in spiritualism, but very few of us are aware that there is a really rich Canadian history in spiritualism. And although I've spoken here about Jenny Pincock before, and I hope you'll indulge me if I touch on her just again, there are a whole host of other figures that many of us don't know about, have never heard about, and have really contributed to spiritualism in Canada. In a topic near and dear to my heart, I wrote my MA thesis on Jenny Pincock over 30 years ago now. And that particular research sparked my interest in spiritualism, particularly, and in Canadian spiritualism, just because so much is written about the Brits and the Americans, and not much attention is paid here in the same way. So I'd love to tell you about all of it, but I'm just going to touch on a few people today through the limitations of time. I'd also like to say that this is a history, not a theology lecture. So please hear that, because some of the people, of course, we're talking about lived quite some time ago, and spiritualism has progressed in many, many ways, and we all have our own particular past. So what I'm talking to you about is history and other people's views of spiritualism in their time. The first gentleman I'd like to share with you is B.F. Austin. Now, he was born in 1850 in Brighton, Upper Canada, and he's actually fairly well known in spiritualist circles. If you walk into the museum at Lilydale, his picture is right inside the front door. So he was a gentleman who was very well known. He was really well educated. He'd received his BA from Albert College in Belleville, and he later obtained an MA and a BD as well from that same college. And Victoria University in Toronto would give him an honorary doctorate of divinity in 1896. Austin was ordained as a Methodist minister and was the first principal of the Alma Ladies College in St. Thomas. When he became interested in psychic phenomena, he began first really to investigate it in terms of scientific validity. And in his book, Glimpses of the Unseen, published around 1898, he examined psychic phenomenon really in that light. That's what he was after, to be able to put forward scientific theories that he was finding in the Society of Psychical Research, which is the American Society for Spiritualist Investigation. To say that the Methodist Church disapproved of this would be a mild understatement. And Austin was actually expelled from the church in 1899 for heresy. He was okay with this. He actually wrote them a letter about how okay he was with that. But it's typical of the kinds of things that were happening to ordained people in this time period, that if they embraced spiritualism, often the mainstream denomination would expel them or literally try them for heresy. Austin, at that point, as he said, unfettered by any alliance with creeds or dogmas, then became an enthusiastic spiritualist. And he wrote nearly 30 pamphlets and a number of books on the subject, including offering the preface to Jenny O'Hara Pincock's Trails of Truth in 1930. Now you can still find a lot of these. Austin's ABCs of Spiritualism, I know, can be downloaded online as a PDF, and it's actually quite understandable today. Not much is altered in terms of actual practice and belief in the kinds of things that he outlines in that pamphlet. But it's a really interesting glimpse into what was happening in Canada in that time, because it was very typical of the kinds of things that spiritualists were laying out kind of as practices and beliefs that they were engaged in that time period. So I would strongly recommend trying to get your hands on Austin's ABCs of Spiritualism. Jenny Pincock actually believes she spoke to Austin following his death through the mediumship of William Carthuser. I know that when I was researching, I had to have a little list, of when Austin died and when Jenny said she talked to him, because, some of those moments were before his death, but many of those moments were also after. So it was very interesting to hear that there was contact after spirit. This next gentleman is Thomas Glendinning Hamilton. He lived from 1873 to 1935. And he was born first in Agincourt, Ontario, and then he moved west to Saskatchewan and settled in Saskatoon. Eventually settled in Saskatoon. When his father died, when Thomas was 18, his mother moved the family to Winnipeg. And Thomas went to the Manitoba College there and graduated from medical school in 1903. He interned at Winnipeg General Hospital and set up his medical practice in Winnipeg in 1905. So he was a practicing physician, a well-educated man. He held a number of very distinguished positions. He was the president of the Manitoba Medical Association in 1915. He was on the public school board for 9 years, and one of those he was chair. And he served as a member of the provincial legislature from 1914 to 1915. And it was after the death of his son, Arthur, in 1918, that he started to really look into psychic phenomena. And over the course of several years, Thomas and his wife, Lillian, hosted seances in their rooms, in their home. And they captured evidence of all kinds of physical manifestation, because of course in the 30s, physical manifestation was really one of the primary practices of spiritualism at the time. They reported rappings, psychokinesis, ectoplasm, and materializations. And it was very important for them to witness these and be able to replicate them under scientific conditions. A lot of people came to these seances. They invited quite a few people to them, and the guest list for some of their seances included Arthur Conan Doyle. So Arthur Conan Doyle actually sat in on some of the Hamilton seances. The really fascinating thing about the Hamilton investigations in particular is that they took enormous amounts of pictures during the courses of their seances. And these are absolutely fascinating. And you can look at them because the Hamilton seance, the Hamilton collection is held at the University of Manitoba. And many of the photographs are posted online. And, some of them I look at and I don't know what to make of them. And some of them are just like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that that's a thing. So there's spirit photography, there's ectoplasm, there's some table levitation in there, I believe, in what's posted. And all of these pictures are publicly available. All of the pictures that are publicly available are posted on the website at the University of Manitoba. Hamilton's work became really well known in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and the United States. And he traveled extensively between 1926 and 1935 and did over 85 lectures on the phenomenon that he was witnessing in his seances. And he published plenty of articles that were published both in Canada and abroad. He died in 1935, and his wife Lillian carried this on after his death. But this is, I think Hamilton is important because he was so evidential, because there's so much remaining of his work. Thomas Lacy was a medium who lived between 1895 and 1966. And he was a direct voice medium. He was originally from England. He was born in Derbyshire on November the 4th, 1895. He married his wife Edith in 1918 in Whitfield, and they immigrated to Canada in March of 1923, and April of 1924. Edith came a little bit later than he did. He originally worked as a mechanical engineer at companies including Dominion Rubber, Sutherland, and Schultz. Now, this is the fun and exciting thing for me, is that Thomas conducted many, many, many seances over a number of years in Kitchener-Waterloo, and actually in a house 2 blocks from me. I lovingly refer to it as the seance house. It's this big, old, beautiful Victorian that looks a little bit out of place on the street where I live. And it's in the hands of his grandchildren today. And and those seances began in 1924. And although Edith was not a medium herself, she was an active participant. At one point, they did move out to Hamilton in the 1950s before returning to Kitchener-Waterloo in the 1960s. And the exciting thing about the seances that resumed in the 1960s is they're recorded. So there are actually many, many audio recordings of the seances that Lacy conducted in the home of Otto and Nelda Smith, the house 2 blocks down from me. And I think this is also typical of spiritualist practice at the time. Otto was a local businessman. He was an insurance salesman. And on regular Sundays, he played the organ at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, just the other way down the road a little bit, because a lot of people saw spiritualism as an add-on almost to their current religious practice. So I don't think that Otto ever actually saw what having the seances Sunday night in his basement as a contradiction of his Lutheranism on Sunday morning. And a lot of people in that time period were kind of in the same boat. So when you listen to the tapes of Thomas Lacy, and I'm going to give you links later so that you can find these. When you listen to the tapes of Thomas Lacy, you can hear a number of very distinct voices. His main spirit, he believed his main spirit control during the 1960s was a spirit named Amara. And he also believed that his younger brother, Walter, who had passed very young, I think he might have been 8, but don't quote me on that, acted as a gatekeeper. Certainly Walter in the seance tapes sounds like a young boy. And during the course of the seances, they believed that Lacy channeled the spirits of Edison, Emanuel Swedenborg, John Wesley, and others. The sitters who were involved in these seances, and many of them were regulars, were said to have experienced apports, materializations, automatic writing, and one seance recording also contains what's believed to be an example of electronic voice phenomenon. And if you go on the archive that holds these, you'll be able to hear that. The seances had 3 general categories. They had a master's night, where it was mostly theological discussions would come through, or philosophical discussions would come through. And that's the kind of things they would be listening to. They had a visiting night, so more like platform mediumship today, where the spirits of friends and family would come through. And they also held what they called a rescue night, where the sitters would try to help spirits who had not crossed over to do so. And some of the transcripts of those are very fascinating. Thomas died in June of 1966 at the age of 70, and Edith followed him in 1993, and they're both buried at the Parkview Cemetery, Waterloo, not all that far from me. Now, this is one Canadian spiritualist that almost everybody knows about, because it was a little sensationalized right after his death. But William Lyon Mackenzie King also had a connection to Kitchener, lived here for some time. So it's interesting to me that a lot of these folks actually had connection. He was not a member of the Spiritualist Church. So I think that's, again, important and not unusual of people who are practicing in Canada and early spiritualism. He kind of to the end of his days, had you asked him, I think he would have said he was a Presbyterian. But he did absolutely believe in life after death, and he was a dedicated Christian. He started experimenting with spiritualism in the 1920s, but it was in the 1930s when he really began consulting spirit more regularly, and when he was attending seances more often. In particular, he would talk to his family, to his grandfather, father, brother. His mother is the most often reported, that he did a very close relationship with his mom, and that he sought her out quite a bit. He's also to have reportedly spoken to his political mentor, Wilfrid Laurier, in the course of seances. Now, one of the reasons that this was kept so quiet during the time that he was in office is that people did not want others to think that he was making decisions of state based on the instruction of spirit. And I think he would have absolutely said that's not what he was doing. In fact, there was one medium, Helen Hughes, that he visited quite sometimes, and she sat with him over the course of many, many years. And one of the things that she said to a reporter that I just loved, because I think that this spoke to me anyway, in terms of why I think a lot of us come to spiritualism. She said, it was as if he had his mother living over here in Britain. What would any son do? If he came here on business, he'd look her up. He'd want to see her and talk to her. He'd want advice, for he knew more about them. He wouldn't want advice about political affairs, for he knew more about them than she did. He wanted to know how she was, whom she was with. He wanted to talk to her about family matters. And I think that's true. That just struck me as, yeah, that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that we all kind of look for. Often mediums were not told who he was. And, you know, at this period of time, you could probably get away with that. And I'm also told that he was a little suspicious about numbers, or superstitious about numbers, 7 and 17 particularly. And so he paid close attention to messages that he got in his dreams, and he also regularly described his dreams in his diary. So that's William Lyon Mackenzie King. I think it took all of 2 weeks after he died before someone to leak that he'd been a spiritualist. Okay, this is a gentleman near and dear to my heart, and I think that is hardly known in spiritualist history circles. His name was Frederick Maines. He lived between 1888 and 1959, and he was the pastor of the Church of Divine Revelation, which was formed in St. Catharines in 1930. He's pictured here with his wife, Minnie, and his daughter, Colleen. And he was originally a Presbyterian minister, became a United Church ministry when those church bodies melded, the Methodist Church, the Congregational Union, the Presbyterian Church. However, he too was expelled from the United Church for heresy in 1931. The official charge being that he had undertaken to serve as a minister in a church which was not formed with the consent of a Presbytery of the United Church of Canada. And that church was the Spiritualist Church of Divine Revelation in St. Catharines. The founding of the Church of Divine Revelation coincided with the publication of Trails of Truth, and this is where he's near and dear to my heart. The book written by his sister-in-law, Jenny O'Hara Pincock. So his wife, Minnie, and Jenny were sisters. And the founding of the church and the book attracted the attention of local clergy and mainstream churches in the area. They actually had like a public debate ensue in the local newspaper between local churches and local clergy and spiritualists through a series of letters to the editor. It's like it reads like this crazy debate back and forth as letters to the editor in the St. Catharines Standard, just responding one to the other. And finally, there was so many of these that the editor put a stop to it on March 28th, 1932. But the spiritualist community remained a center of contention in the community. As a traditionally trained clergyman, Fred often reinterpreted the Bible through the lens of spiritualism and wrote a number of interesting articles in the journal Progression, which was edited by Jenny. And Fred's writing in particular, I find fascinating because it's a good example of how many spiritualists at the time reconciled the Christian traditions in which they'd been raised with the new revelations they'd received in spiritualism. And the entire library of Progression can be downloaded free from Brock University Archives, and I'll post that for you too. Fred and Minnie, incidentally, as a little personal aside, I hadn't known it at the time that we picked the burial space, but they're buried about 20 feet away from my daughter. So that was just one of our weird little synchronicities over the course of time. Susanna Moody. Most of us know Susanna as a Canadian writer, but she and her sister Catherine Partel were actually involved in spiritualism. She wrote a lot of children's books, poetry, short stories, articles, novels. She was not that warm about backwoods life as she came to understand it. She emigrated here from England, and she wrote a lot about what it was like to move here, what the customs were, what American-Canadian relations were like, what wildlife was like, and the strong sense of community in the new colony where she lived. So there were a lot of really interesting things that we get from Susanna Moody's writings about what it's like to be basically a middle-class English woman dropped in the bush. And they were not far, and what that was like to experience. In 1840, after her husband John was appointed sheriff in the county of Hastings, they moved to Belleville and had 2 more children there. Sadly, they lost their son John after he died in the Moira River in 1844. She was actually excommunicated in 1845 from the Congregational Church that they helped to found due to a disorderly walk and neglect of church fellowship. Both Susanna and John had, started to delve into spiritualism and were really trying to understand it scientifically. In this 1854-1855, Kate Fox was staying in Prince Edward County with her sister Elizabeth, particularly in the summer of 1855. And Susanna and her husband John were able to have a seance with her, and afterward attended several seances in Belleville around the time. Like a lot of people at the time, Moody really tried to reconcile her Christianity and with spiritualism. And in doing so, she described spiritualism as a new revelation from God to man. And both Susanna Moody and her husband John wrote many letters and journals about their seance experiences. Moody and other members of her family, including her sister Catherine Partrail, and her daughter Agnes, actually acted as mediums. And they believe that Moody believes she was able to contact the spirit of her son who had drowned. John Dunbar Moody, her husband, constructed something he called a spiritoscope. You have to look that up online because I can't adequately describe it. It was like a big rolling machine that would help in the contacting of people who had passed. And he also compiled a work known as the Spiritualist Album from letters, materials, and things from their seances. But after her parents' death, Catherine Moody Vickers removed some of this because she was trying to protect her sister and other family members because spiritualism was still not well regarded.
Thank you so much, Dorinda. I just wanted to let you know that we're running short on time.
No problem. So I will skip Jenny because you've heard plenty about her, and I'm just going to, for you, post some resources for further study into the chat so that you can have a look at some of the spiritualist archives and things that you can download online for yourselves.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Dorinda. Wow, there was a lot of information in there, very informative. And I really do believe and agree with you. There is not enough known about Canadian spiritualism. And that, even in our education over here, we learn a lot about the American and the UK, but we do learn some of the Canadian, but we need to make the Canadian history bigger in its presence to stand beside the others as well. Not a pun there by the others.
I've copied the links and we'll provide them in an email to everyone.
Wonderful. Oh, they're in the chat too. Yeah.
Yeah, I've taken them from the chat and we'll provide them to everybody.
Perfect. So I'm going to have to say, I don't know if you folks, do you want to stay a few minutes extra for a couple messages, or would you like to stick to time? It's totally up to you. Okay, no response. Crickets. Come on, folks. Don't make me feel like I'm standing at inspiration stump here.
I think it would be great to hear a couple of readings.
Okay. All good. Okay. Kathy is typing. Let's do it. Okay. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to skip the second song so that Dorinda has more time for her message portion of the service. I'm just going to say the prayer for mediumship for spirit message, and then it's yours. Loving divine, make us a clear connection for spirit. May only what we receive be of your divine love and light, with message for the highest and best for all. Guide us, be with us, as we endeavor to be the best we can be for those here and in spirit. Amen. Dorinda, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm muted. There we go. That is usually not.
There you go. And I will
That is not
unmute
helpful.
everybody so that, let me see, who is, okay, I'm just going to unmute people or ask them to unmute so that people can speak up. Perfect. There you go. It's yours.
Okay. I sent a message to Randy, but perhaps he's not seeing. I prefer not to record messages if that's all right. I don't mind lectures, but I prefer not to
But
record messages.
we don't record messages.
Okay.